This is John Cohen. Welcome to another episode of Hypothetically Speaking. In the last episode, I was taking a close look at GROK, the artificial intelligence engine that is Elon Musk's venture. And I guess XAI, the company, is the company that just acquired X, formerly known as Twitter. So XAI is I guess a big entity with a lot of capital because it paid something like $40 billion or something like that for X. So I've been working with GROK and using it as a bit of like a research assistant. And it's been helpful in some ways, and in other ways I think I may have stumbled upon its bias in some ways, or almost like a naivete. In other words, it looks like GROK believes the narrative per se in a number of situations, and when presented with new evidence, it seems to get what I can only call uncomfortable, or at least that's my observation. I have some new interactions with it that I'm going to share with you. The first one is actually very meaningful, and I think it's going to lead to a mea culpa. I think as a result of this first interaction with GROK, you're going to find out that the impact in Akure, Nigeria was not a rock the size of a volleyball. So I may have misspoken. I was underestimating the size of what is called the bolide. When an asteroid turns into a meteor and it starts rocketing through the atmosphere, that rock itself is called a bolide, B-O-L-I-D-E. And it appears that the bolide may have been bigger than a volleyball or a basketball significantly. We're going to take a look at that. So why don't we do that? Let's cut over to GROK. Let's take a look at this first interaction that I had. And then I'm going to take you through a couple other interactions that get very interesting, where it seems like the artificial intelligence engine may have, I don't know if I want to say it has an agenda, but certainly has a perspective that it does not want to come off of, and we'll take a closer look at that. So here comes the first scenario, and this is a question that I posed to GROK. Let me read it to you. I just found an asteroid impact crater in the outback of Australia. It is 60 meters across and about 7 meters deep. Can you estimate the size, mass, and diameter of the bolide that caused it, assuming it was traveling at approximately 25,000 miles per hour? Okay, so those are sort of some baseline assumptions that we want to go with. And so for something like this, GROK is pretty good because it can do all these calculations and stuff and give you all these formulas. So GROK comes back and says estimating the size, mass, and diameter of a bolide, a meteor that impacts the Earth, based on the crater it leaves behind, involves some rough approximations, as the outcome depends on factors like the bolide's composition, velocity, angle of impact, and the target surface's properties. Since you've provided the crater dimensions, 60 meters across, 7 meters deep, and a velocity, 25,000 miles per hour, or 11.2 kilometers per second, I'll use simplified scaling relationships from impact crater studies to give you an estimate. Okay. For a crater 60 meters in diameter, we can start with empirical formulas derived from terrestrial impact data. One commonly used relationship for small craters is the transient crater diameter scaling, which is later modified by collapse and erosion to form the final crater. The transient crater diameter d in meters can be approximated for a rocky bolide impacting sedimentary or loose soil, typical of the Australian outback, as, and then they provide the formula. Now, I'm guessing that most of you did not know this formula. I sure as hell didn't, right? And then this thing goes ahead and does the math for you. Now, I'm going to assume that it's getting the math right and that I don't have to double check all this stuff. But this, to me, is incredibly helpful. So it comes back with an answer, and it says its estimate is that the diameter is 12 to 13 meters across. That's huge. That's 40 feet. 36 to 40 feet across. That's the size of a house. This is the back of an envelope calculation. Real-world variables like impact angle, bolide type could tweak it a bit. What do you think? And I wrote back and I said, 10 to 50 kilotons seems high since Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. All right, and let's see what happens. What does GROK do with that when I tell it, I think you might be off? GROK says you're absolutely right to question that. Comparing the energy to Hiroshima does put things in perspective, and it's worth refining the estimate to ensure it aligns with the crater size. A 60-meter crater is relatively small in the grand scheme of impacts, and 15 kilotons, Hiroshima, would indeed suggest a much larger event. Let's double check the energy involved and see if we can reconcile this. So I'm kind of impressed that the engine is reconsidering this, given this new input. All right. And it seems that for mathematical scenarios like this, it's open to this. And what we're going to see is that when we get to some more word problems later and some date arithmetic, it's less open to suggestions. Again, I feel, this is my observation. You guys might say, you're not being fair. That's not cool. So you'll see in a minute. But it says you're absolutely right to question it. It's going to recalculate. It's going through this again. It's converting TNT to kilotons here into joules and all that. And so it says, so the raw kinetic energy of a 12 to 13 meter bolide at that speed is around 46 kilotons on the high end of my initial range. But you're spot on. Hiroshima's 15 kiloton yield produced a blast that leveled a city, while a 60-meter crater suggests a much more localized event. Exactly. Not all that kinetic energy goes into crater formation. Much is lost to atmospheric energy, heat, and fragmentation. That's true too. For small craters, only a fraction of the kinetic energy actually excavates the crater. Studies of impact mechanics, for example, Malash, 1989, suggest a crater-forming energy scales with the bolide size and speed, but the efficiency drops for smaller impacts. A better approach for a 60-meter crater is to use observed analogs like Meteor Crater, which is 1,200 meters wide and 150 meters deep. And Jason and I went and visited that in, October of 2022, I think. We went to visit, it was either 2022, 2023, we went to visit Meteor Crater. And this was spectacular, not just to see it, but the education that we got about things like shocked quartz and strachiated, S-T-R-A-C-C-I-A-T-E-D, strachiated quartz, stuff like that we learned about at the museum that they have there. So it was really an educational thing to learn more about what characteristics do you see in meteor craters that are kind of common across all the meteor craters. So it talks about this, formed from a 50 meter iron meteorite with a yield of 10 to 20 megatons. So this is kind of the thing that I'm like, if Meteor Crater in Arizona was 10 to 20 megatons, this is the one that Jason and I went to. And how the hell would the one in Akure be 50 megatons? It's like there was no way. So scaling down, a 60-meter crater is often linked to yields in the 1 to 5 kiloton range for stony bolides based on numerical models and events like the 1947 Seacoast Allen impact. Now, the 1947 Seacoast Allen impact was not actually an impact. That was an airburst. It took place about 3.5 miles up in the sky during the daytime. So a lot of people saw it. A lot of rock came raining down, but there was no impact crater per se. There was no bolide that just came rocketing down and just went boom and made a big impact crater. The rocks that, when it exploded in the air, the fragments of it came down, and each one of those made a pockmark, but we're not like this. So I don't really consider the 1947 Seacoast Allen meteorite, bolide, I don't really consider that an impact event. I consider that an airburst. Recalibrating. A 60-meter crater typically corresponds to a bolide 5 to 15 meters in diameter, with energy closer to 1 to 5 kilotons for a stony object at 11 kilometers per second. Adjusting the size downward, a 7 to 8 meter bolide gives 1 to 2 kilotons. This fits better. A 1 to 2 kiloton impact could produce a 60-meter crater without the widespread devastation of Hiroshima. The original 12 to 13 meter estimate likely overestimated the size due to simplifying assumptions about crater scaling and energy transfer. Aha! So by questioning and challenging the GROK engine, it's telling you this is a better fit. Now, the reason I'm doing this is not to show off. The reason I'm doing this is to show you that the engine will consider new evidence in certain circumstances. And when you put new information in, it does not want to consider. It's very interesting here. So that's why I'm showing you this. So I don't want you to think I'm showing off. I'm showing you this so that we're establishing a pattern. It's considering new evidence. It's scratching its head, so to speak, and saying, you're right. Let's reevaluate this. And when we go to these next conversations, what you're going to see is it's not quite as open-minded on some other topics. All right, so this fits better. A 1.2 kiloton impact could produce a 60-meter crater without the widespread devastation of Hiroshima. The original 12 to 13 meter estimate likely overestimated the size due to simplifying the assumptions about crater scaling and energy transfer. Revised estimate: diameter 7 to 8 meters, mass 500 metric tons, and energy 1 to 2 kilotons. This feels more consistent with a small, fresh crater and avoids the Hiroshima scale mismatch. Does that seem more reasonable to you? No. 7 meters in diameter is 1/3 the size of the bolide that caused Barringer crater. Still too big. Okay, so what I'm suggesting is 7 meters in diameter is 21 feet across. The one in Barringer crater was 50 meters, so I said it's 1/3 the size. All right, so Barringer crater was maybe 100 feet across. Maybe it was 35 meters to 50 meters. So if it was 35 meters, this is a quarter of the size, a third of the size. So I'm saying, how does something that's a third of the size of Barringer crater with 1.2 kilometers across form something that's only 180 feet across? That doesn't make any sense. And GROK comes back and says, you're right to call that out. My earlier revision didn't fully align with the crater size you described. I mistakenly referenced the Barringer crater's bolide 30 to 50 meters. All right, so I'm going right now with the smaller estimate, 30 meters, when I should have focused strictly on your 60-meter wide, 7-meter deep crater in Australia. That's a little white lie I'm telling GROK. I don't want it to know I'm talking about Africa. Let's recalibrate using that specific data and avoid overestimating based on larger analogs. So this is now iterative. We're going through this now another time with GROK. So before though they had the rocket, it was the size of an office building, and we're going down using logic. So using logic and explaining it to GROK in a manner that it can interpret, it's considering it and refining, which I find fascinating. You're right to call it out. It didn't align. For a 60-meter crater, the energy required is much smaller than for Barringer's 1,200-meter crater. The depth to diameter ratio you gave, 7 meters to 60 meters, 1.81 to 8.6, suggests a simple crater, typical of impacts below 3 kilometers in diameter. Yeah, well, we're far below 3 kilometers in diameter, where depth is roughly 1/5 to 1/10 of the width. So we're right in there. And by the way, these measurements, the 7 meters and the 60 meters, those were the measurements that the professor took. So the professor sent the drone up, and using photogrammetry and stuff, you can measure things using the drone. So they measured it, and it was 7 meters deep and 60 meters across. So it says that's right in the range. So that's a fit. The bolide size depends on its velocity. I use 25,000 miles per hour just because it's kind of right in the breadbasket of what we see on that CNEO site that I go to all the time. There are some that are faster. There are a few that are slower, but not much slower. The ones that are faster, some of them are 40,000 miles an hour, 45,000 miles an hour. So some of them are significantly faster, but I didn't want to assume that. So I wanted to go with something that's just kind of in the middle. So the bolide size depends on its velocity, density, and the target material, but we can estimate using scaling laws tailored to the smaller scale. A widely used approximation for crater diameter in loose soil or sedimentary rock common in the Australian outback is, and by the way, this loose soil sedimentary rock is the same soil composition as we see in Akure, Nigeria, right? So that's loose soil. It's an agricultural area, farming area, very rich soil there. So this is consistent. And the fact that they've got this formula is fascinating. I mean, I don't have any tattoos, but I might get this one. This is the widely used approximation for crater diameter in loose soil sedimentary rock. I mean, who knew that, right? So that's a good one. And it explains what all these variables are, and it's using the stony bolide density, and it's calculating. And it says the 12.5 meter estimate is still too large if you're comparing it to Barringer's bolide, which made et cetera, et cetera. All right, more math. Let's get to the end here. This fits better. 2.9 kilotons aligns with the 60 meter final estimate. All right, so now, so it's suggesting to me 2.9 kilotons. 3 kilotons is 1/5 of Hiroshima, with a 60-meter crater's expected energy 1.5 kiloton, and a 5-meter bolide is 1/12 the crater diameter, consistent with small impact ratios. Mass is 200 metric tons. A 5-meter bolide, that's 15 feet. That's bigger, taller than a single-story house. So if where you live there are single-story ranch homes, right, a ranch house, a single-story home, this is bigger than that. This is 15 feet tall. All right, so this is huge they're talking about here. So I suggest to GROK that we come at this differently. All right, so another iteration. I said, let's come at this differently. Assume a diameter of 0.5 meter, 18 inches, okay, and a very high density, iron composition, traveling at 25,000 miles per hour. What kiloton force would that produce at impact, assuming a 90-degree impact angle, meaning perfectly perpendicular? I don't want it to have to bleed off energy because it's kind of skipping across the atmosphere. Assume it's coming straight down, straight in. It's a rock 0.5 meter across. That's only 18 inches. Right? This is something you buy at the garden store, right? An 18-inch polished granite rock you put in your garden. All right? So assume that's moving 25,000 miles an hour. What kind of kiloton force does that generate? And again, this is what I like GROK for, is doing this kind of math real quick. You used to use the HP12C. This is a little bit more convenient. Let's calculate the kinetic energy and TNT equivalent for a 0.5 meter diameter bolide traveling at 25,000 miles an hour with a very high density, assuming a 90-degree impact angle. The perpendicular angle maximizes energy transfer to the ground, so this is a good starting point. Since you mentioned very high density, I'll assume an iron meteorite. Typical density is 7,800 kilograms per cubic meter. Wow. Which is denser than the stony type and plausible for a small, tough object surviving atmospheric entry. This is a key thing. The fact that the meteor turns into a bolide and makes impact means the likelihood that it was one of these stony ones is lower, and the likelihood that it had high iron content is higher, because those don't break up as much. It's the stony ones that break up. The ones that are made out of iron tend to kind of survive. And it looks like this one was a combination of stones and iron, and you'll see that in a little sample I'll show you later. All right, so here it goes ahead and calculates the mass of a 0.5 meter radius meteor. And it does the iron meteorite density and comes back and says it weighs 510 kilograms. That's over 1,000 pounds. An 18-inch ball, an 18-inch rock weighs over 1,000 pounds. So imagine a 1,000-pound cannonball going 25,000 miles an hour. What does that generate? And it says that's equivalent to 7.65 tons of TNT, but that's only 0.007 kilotons. So it says a 0.5 meter iron bolide at this speed is 7.65 tons of TNT, far below the 1 kiloton. This makes sense for a small object. Its mass limits the energy even at high speed and density. For comparison, the Chelyabinsk meteor from 2013 was 17 to 20 meters across and yielded about 500 kilotons. All right, but that burst up in the air. Would this make a 60-meter crater? Now, small craters scale with energy, but a 7.6-ton yield is closer to events like Karankis. Karankis was a meteor from a 1-meter bolide at 3 kilotons, made a 13-meter crater, but it was like in the mud. This was like in a swampy area, like a marsh, and so very, very soft. And it made a 13-meter crater, so that's about 45 feet across, 45, almost 50 feet across. A 60-meter crater typically needs 1 to 5 kilotons, so this is too low. So it says suggesting a 0.5 meter bolide isn't going to suffice, isn't going to cut it. So this won't do it. Do you want a 60-meter crater? We need a larger bolide, higher velocity. What do you think? Should we tweak it? I said tweak the size upwards until it fits. Let's tweak the bolide size upward from 0.5 meter, keeping the high density, and we have an energy target now. And it does this math for you, which is just fantastic. Solve for the diameter. Here we go. And it says it looks like a diameter of 0.25 meters will yield just under 1 kiloton. All right. I kind of like this. 2.5 meters is about 7-8 feet across, and that yields just under 1 kiloton. But that is a whole lot bigger than a volleyball or a basketball, which is what I originally thought. So I stand corrected. It appears that this may have been a 2.5 to 3 meter bolide, which is 7, 8, 9 feet across. That is a massive, massive rock to be fallen out of the sky. And it seems that this works. All right, so the conclusion here is we've got a 3 meter iron bolide which weighs 110 metric tons, slamming into the earth 25,000 miles an hour, generates 1.5 kilotons, 1.65 kilotons, and that fits the 60-meter wide deep crater. So it appears that the meteor, the bolide, that impacted in Akure, Nigeria, was in fact about 8 or 9 feet across, which is scary, man. That is scary. So no wonder almost 1,000 homes and buildings lost their roofs in the area. I mean, this is 1.5 kilotons. That's 1/10 the energy of Hiroshima in a rural farming area. 1/10 the energy of Hiroshima blew the roofs off 1,000 buildings and homes. All right. So this, I think, kind of sets it up. This iterative process, GROK is open to new suggestions, scratches its head, goes, this is interesting. Comparing it to Hiroshima, comparing it to Barringer Crater. And we got an iterative answer. And everybody's happy, right? It's the art of the deal, by the way. The art of the deal, right? It's a win-win. Everybody wants to have a win-win. Let's go to another scenario that I ran in with GROK. And let's see what you guys think of this one. So in this scenario, I said to GROK, according to the WHO, the first person on Earth to die with SARS-CoV-2 infection was on January 11th, 2020, and the second death was January 15th, 2020, correct? I think they call that leading the witness. Yes, based on available information that appears to be correct. The World Health Organization and other sources indicate that the first reported death from SARS-CoV-2 occurred on January 11th in Wuhan, China. 61-year-old man, regular buyer at the Hunan seafood market, had underlying conditions. He had an abdominal tumor and chronic liver disease. He died of heart failure after treatments failed to improve his symptoms. The second death was reported on January 15th, also in Wuhan, involving a 69-year-old man who succumbed to the illness. These details align with earlier reports from Chinese authorities. No earlier deaths have been officially documented by the WHO or other credible sources. So, we've got our first and second deaths, and GROK and I are in agreement. We then go to this statement, and now you're going to see things start to come off the rails. According to a post from Mike Pence, I write this to GROK, in November 2020, POTUS Trump did a deal with Moderna on January 13th, 2020. On that day, there was only one person on Earth that had died with SARS-CoV-2 infection, correct? Yes, that appears to be correct. Based on available information, the first death from SARS-CoV-2 was reported by Chinese authorities. It repeats all this. It then says by January 13th, when the alleged deal with Moderna was made, according to the claim attributed to Mike Pence, this would still be the only confirmed death globally, as the second death wasn't reported until January 15th. Official timelines from sources like the World Health Organization, early reports from China support the sequence. Indeed. However, here we go. I cannot independently verify the specific claim about the Moderna deal or Pence's statement from November 20th without direct access to that post. But the death count aligns with the known record. So it's saying, if that's the case, yeah, it was just one guy dead. But it's saying, I don't know about any Mike Pence post. So I sent it the Mike Pence post. Here's the Mike Pence post right here. And Mike Pence posted this and said, on January 13th of 2020, Moderna partnered with President real Donald Trump and NIH to develop a vaccine for the American people. Today, Moderna announced their vaccine is 95% effective. Operation Warp Speed is a success because of the strong leadership of this president. And he tweeted this November 16th of 2020 after the election at 7:48 a.m. Right, so they had already called the election for Joe Biden, and at 7:48 a.m. on November 16th of 2020, Mike Pence felt compelled to tweet this out, talking about a partnership with Moderna. But one of the things that was kind of weird is he never mentioned COVID in this tweet, and he never mentioned SARS-CoV-2. All right, so just make note of that. So I send that tweet, or a screenshot of that tweet, to GROK, and I said to GROK wrote, however, I cannot independently verify the specific claim about the Moderna deal or Pence's statement from November 2020 without direct access to the post, but the death count aligns with the known record. Here is that post from Mike Pence from November 16th, 2020 at 7:48 a.m., I tell GROK. And GROK writes back, thank you for providing the post from Mike Pence. The Post, dated November 16th at 7:48 a.m., states on January 13th, developed vaccine. This confirms the claim you referenced about the Moderna deal on January 13th, as stated by Mike Pence. Regarding the death count, as I mentioned earlier, the first death was reported January 11th and the second January 15th, according to official records. Therefore, on January 13th, the day the alleged, it's no longer alleged, right? It's the allegation has been, it's alleged by Mike Pence. All right, there would have been only one reported death from SARS-CoV-2 globally, which aligns with the known timeline. The Post also highlights Moderna's announcement on November 16th about their vaccine being 95% effective. Now we're going off on a tangent here, which matches historical records. Moderna did indeed release interim results from their phase 3 trial on that date, showing 94.5% efficacy, often rounded to 95% in public statements. Operation Warp Speed, a U.S. government initiative to accelerate vaccine development, was heavily promoted by the Trump administration, and this post reflects that narrative. If you'd like to dive deeper, I can. Okay, so I said, wasn't the USA in the midst of a terrible influenza season in January 2020? And the system is not sensitive to typos. So even if you spell a word wrong with a typo, as I did here, it figures that out and just plows ahead, which is great. So you don't really have to spell check your stuff. So I asked, wasn't in the middle of a terrible influenza season? And this should be enlightening. Yes. The United States was indeed experiencing a severe influenza season in January 2020. According to data from the Center for Disease Control, the 2019-2020 flu season was particularly intense, with estimates suggesting that by January 18th of 2020, there had already been at least 15 million flu illnesses. 140,000 hospitalizations, and 8,200 deaths since the season began. No, it's actually 8,200 deaths. There were over 4,000 a week. So we had 8,200 deaths by January 14th. There were that many deaths just since New Year's Day, not since October. Since October, the number's much, much higher. So GROK is off here. By January 25th, 2020, these numbers had risen to approximately 19 million illnesses, 180,000 hospitalizations, and 10,000 deaths. It was 4,000 a week, so by January 25th, it would be more than that. It would be more than 10,000. It was 4,000 every week, more than 4,000. Dr. Fauci, director of NIH, noted in January 2020 that the season was shaping up to be one of the worst in several years, potentially as severe as the 2017-2018 season, which was notably deadly. The CDC later estimated that the entire 2019-2020 season, which ran through April, that's not true, 2020, resulted in 39 to 56 million flu cases, 410,000 to 740,000 hospitalizations, and 24 to 62,000 deaths. The season was marked by two waves. Interesting. An early wave of influenza B, which started in October, disproportionately affected children, followed by a wave of influenza A. Now, influenza A, by the way, is bird flu, but it says H1N1. Influenza A is avian influenza. H1N1, I do not think is the strain that we were seeing. That peaked around February. By late February, CDC reported over 26 million people were sick and 250,000 hospitalized, 14,000 had died, with 105 pediatric deaths, higher number than in any season over the previous decade. Okay? So this is influenza, and it's admitting this, yet it doesn't know that this is influenza burden. What is influenza burden? Let's go back 2 years, 3 years, to a session I did with Dr. Dave Collum, where I showed influenza burden to Dr. Dave Collum and explained what these numbers are and take a look at what he had to say.
Right.
So when they're telling you 22,000 is the burden of flu, what is that? Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is from the paper that defines influenza burden. Take a
So
look.
is that equation? Is that equation?
Yeah, don't you love that?
Reported deaths divided by reported hospitalizations, deaths per hospitalization, times 1/% of deaths that occur in the hospital.
Isn't that cute? This is what I call professional obfuscation. This is
Jesus.
This is when you
Jesus.
pay. This is when you pay 8 or 10 people to come up with a new factor so that nobody can figure out what the hell you're doing.
We call that a fudge factor where I come from.
Look at the pyramids. How do you have a formula that requires geometry to follow the logic here? You see the pyramids in the middle here? They've got a whole logic tree here. I challenge anybody from the CDC to take the data that we just pulled from FluView and show us how they calculated the 22,000.
But you can take that equation and turn it absurd without looking at the pyramid. And that is, if you take reported deaths over percent of deaths that occur in hospitalization, you essentially end up with a ratio that tells you deaths outside the hospital and inside.
Yeah.
Right. And then divide that by hospitalizations. That leads to nonsense, I think. I think that leads to complete nonsense.
So I do a series on my YouTube channel where I read documents like this I call bedtime stories because they're ridiculous and they're boring.
You have a twisted personality.
All right, so as you can see, influenza burden is what we call derived value. It's a calculated number. It's not like a straight up number. It's not how many people died from influenza. It's this crazy formula, and you just saw Dr. Dave Collum and I discuss it. It doesn't really make any sense. So when they tell you that the number of people who died in a given season is 24,000 to 62,000 deaths, again, this is like the cable company saying we'll be there between Tuesday at noon and the following Wednesday at 5 o'clock. It's like, what kind of range is this? 24,000 to 62,000. If you went to a restaurant and you said, how much is today's seafood special? And they said, well, it's somewhere between $24 and $62. You'd say, where? Where in between $24 and $62? So, well, what kind of range is that? So the fact that they're using this just makes no sense. The formula makes no sense. And GROK doesn't know that. All right, so I'm not going to get into that document with GROK right now. But again, GROK has been deceived. GROK has beliefs based on questionable documents. All right, but now is where it gets kind of weird and interesting. So tells us about all these deaths. The season was marked by 2 waves. This influenza A, and it says H1N1, that peaked in February. This many people died, talked about the children. But then it goes on to say the flu season severity was compounded by its early start. The CDC also noted that the flu vaccine for the season was moderately effective. Posts on X from the period also reflect this, with users like I Am John Cullen highlighting that over 4,000 Americans were dying weekly from influenza and pneumonia in January 2020, a trend that continued into February and March. Now, that's a little weird. So, first of all, the fact that it's citing me to me, it doesn't know it's talking to me. I'm logged in. You guys see? Can you guys see my ID? No, I guess you can't. My ID is in the lower left-hand corner. I've got that kind of cropped out here. Let me show you. But I'm logged into the thing right now. There's my ID, the lower left corner. So I'm logged into, X. And it doesn't know it's talking to me, and yet it's citing my posts to me. The second thing that's odd is it's citing my posts, whether it's to me or to anybody. The fact that it's using me as some sort of an authority for this stuff is kind of weird. What it should be noting is that the charts and things that I've posted to back up these claims are in fact legit and are anchored in the data from the CDC. But it's citing me highlighting the 4,000 Americans were dying a week. However, it's worth considering the broader context. While the influenza season was indeed severe, the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 in January 2020, first identified in Wuhan, China on January 7th, no, it was first identified January 9th, began to shift public health focus. By the way, it does not understand videos. So if I post the video of the WHO guy telling us the timeline, it doesn't understand that. But it does understand screenshots that it can like read the data. It's doing like OCR on images, but it can't understand videos yet. That'll be a meaningful thing when you can post a video and have it listen to it, turn that into a transcript and comprehend that. And if it can simply turn each one of the screens into images, I mean, that's what it's doing now. It's doing, image evaluation. It can turn a video into, it doesn't have to be 24 frames a second. They can probably get away with 12. But the idea here is that it does not yet know how to interpret a video that's posted. It just knows how to interpret images. So it's talking about this date, January 7th, is off by 2 days, began to shift public health focus. The first U.S. case of COVID-19 was confirmed January 21st in Washington State. And while there's no evidence of widespread COVID-19 circulation in the U.S. at the time, some have speculated about whether early flu-like illnesses might have included undiagnosed COVID-19 cases. A user on X, TRVRB, Trevor Bedford. Now Trevor Bedford's interesting because Trevor Bedford is the guy who built NextStrain. And NextStrain is fantastic software. One of the most important pieces of software in the epidemiology world. And it's really well done. So I'm a big fan of his work. So he noted the flu season was driven by influenza B and H1N1, and that researchers would have noticed if COVID-19 had been circulating earlier. I agree with him, as the first known cases arrived in January and February. Still, the lack of widespread COVID-19 testing in early 2020 leaves room for skepticism about whether all widespread respiratory deaths were accurately attributed to influenza. The influenza season's abrupt decline by April 2020. Now, here it could cite me, as documented in John Collins' white paper, right? But it doesn't do that. Shortened by 5 to 6 weeks. Now, this is another thing people need to understand. Influenza season doesn't end. The CDC tracks influenza from October 1st to September 30th, and they consider that a season. So October 1st of 2024 was the beginning of the influenza season. Right now I'm recording this on Thursday, April the 3rd, and we're still in the 2024-2025 influenza season. It doesn't end until September 30th, at which point the next day they start the next season. So this idea that the season ends is that's like a false reality. That's not the case. The season doesn't end. Dr. Ann Sushat said in one of the videos that I published, influenza is evergreen. It never goes away. There's always people sick with influenza, and there's always people dying from influenza every week, all the time in the United States, for sure. All right, so it's telling me about the abrupt decline, shortened by 5 to 6 weeks, was attributed to social distancing and lockdowns implemented to curb COVID-19, which also reduced flu transmission. This raises questions about how public health narratives may have shifted focus from influenza to COVID-19 as the latter gained prominence, potentially overshadowing the flu's impact in public memory. Nonetheless, the data clearly shows that January 2020 was a peak period for a particularly bad flu season in the U.S. independent of the emerging COVID-19 threat. All right, that's pretty good. That's pretty supportive stuff right there. I then asked GROK if the USA had 4,000 people dying every week from pneumonia and influenza, P&I, and only one person had died on Earth with SARS-CoV-2, maybe the vaccines Trump ordered on January 13th, 2020 were really for influenza. and not SARS-CoV-2, since Mike Pence doesn't mention COVID or SARS-CoV-2, right? Now, I'm going to continue this conversation and tell you what GROK said, and I'm going to share this with my patrons. My patrons make this work possible. I do this full time, and without my patrons, I couldn't do this full time. So my patrons subscribe at patreon.com and subscribestar.com for $5 a month, or I think it's $54 a year. They take 10% off if you sign up for the whole year. And then you gain access to things that I do just for my patrons and things that really get kind of deep. And so I put this portion out on YouTube and on X, formerly known as Twitter. And for my patrons, we're going to continue this, and we're going to go to another conversation that I had with GROK, where I said, I'm a physician, and I want to test my patients for H7N9 influenza A. What are my options? And so I'm going to go through that with the patrons as well. But we're going to continue this. I said if 4,000 people were dying a week, and President Trump ordered vaccines on January 13th, were they really for influenza? And maybe not for SARS-CoV-2, since Mike Pence doesn't mention it. And GROK says it's an interesting point about the context of the time and the specifics. And so we're going to get into this with the patrons in just a moment. I'm John Cohen. Thanks for joining Hypothetically Speaking.
Every time you come around, you know I can't say no. Every time the sun goes down, I let you take control. I can feel the paradise before my world implodes. And tonight had something wonderful. My bad habits lead to late nights and